folks, welcome back to another episode of the Podcast Digest. This week, episode 58, another great guest to talk about another great show. But before I bring her on, I just want to take a quick minute, as I have been lately, folks, and thank all of you for your feedback, for listening, for letting me know that I have been regularly filling up your subscription list with lots of great stuff to check out. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed, especially these last few months. And now that we're past the year mark, I'm really excited about some of the things that are coming up for the Podcast Digest. One reminder I'd like to let you guys know about: if you have a show that you love, go to the website, thepodcastdigest.info. On the right-hand column, there is a page that says recommend a podcast yourself. Tell me about what you love. Tell me about what you like, what you think I need to hear, whether it's your own show, a show you love, a show somebody told you about. Little quick Google form there will allow you to tell me all about it, and that has been my major source of finding new shows here lately, to take what you guys are listening to, and then I check it out, subscribe, start listening, and your show may be featured right here on the Podcast Digest. And if I do, I'll be sure to give you guys a shout out as well. So appreciate all of your suggestions there. On to this week's show, another one I am super excited about, and to learn more about myself. My guest this week is Erica Heilman from Vermont Rumble Strip. Erica, welcome to the Podcast Digest. Thank you very much for taking the time to join me, and I'm very happy to get to know you and a little bit about Rumble Strip Vermont a little bit more. So to start off, I'd like everyone to know a little bit about you, a little bit about your non-show related background, if you will. Can you tell folks a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what your background is?
Well, I am from here. I'm from Vermont. I was born here. How far back do you want to go? I mean, I'm from here, and then I left and I went to Chicago, and then I majored in musical theater, which is a sort of an odd trajectory or part of my story. Essentially majored in tap dancing for a few years, and then was in theater, and then I had a job once where I was picking up, those decals on the front of shirts with strings that stick out, the embroidery. I had a job where I was cutting the strings off the back of patches. And then I worked at McNeil Air NewsHour for a little while. And then I got interested in documentary when I was living in New York. And so I did documentary television for a while, and then I wanted to move back to Vermont, and so I taught myself how to do radio, and then I became a private investigator, and then I, because it was a very similar skill set as documentary, minus the actual show part, and then it was, 3 years ago now, decided to start a podcast, so that's the long answer.
The long and winding road that brought you to where we are now today. That is a super interesting history, and it sounds like we could have an hour-long episode about half a dozen of those topics in terms of teaching yourself radio or life as a private investigator, or teach yourself documentary style radio, I guess is correct. That's what you were referring to. You got into documentary radio?
Yeah, I guess that, I was in documentary television, which I loved, but it was very expensive to produce television, and so I did that for a number of years at WNET, and I worked for independent documentary producers there in the city for a number of years, and I really loved that, but I also found that I wasn't really that committed to the picture part, to the video. I was more interested in the story, but it also is a far more expensive proposition, television. You need a lot of money, and you need or at least at that time you did. Perhaps the digital revolution has changed that too, but it was very expensive, and I also didn't think I was going to be able to stay in the city, that my time was running out. I needed to get back to the country, or there was some compulsion to leave. So I taught myself how to edit audio, which was terrible. It was a horrible thing because it was Pro Tools then, and it was way more program than I needed. and it was really complicated. And I really, I cried many tears teaching myself Pro Tools. But then, then everything changed. I moved back to Vermont. I sort of then had a child, so had to find gainful employment, and went to work for a friend of mine who was a private investigator here in Vermont, and then became, in a number of years later, sort of came back to audio and started a podcast, I guess in 2013. Yeah, 2013. Mostly because I wanted to force myself to be producing regularly, and that was a way to kind of hold my own feet to the fire. So that's how that happened.
In that podcast in 2013, is that what we now know as Rumble Strip Vermont?
Yeah. So it was, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's been around now. It's in its third year.
It's 2015. Yeah, so I started in May 2013. So how many years is that?
Yes, that's actually excellent in terms of sort of endurance or long running. That to keep going back and back and back. And so when you initially had the idea, you said to kind of keep yourself or force yourself to keep producing this work. What was the idea when you were deciding, the topic? And because maybe earlier on it was maybe a little more Vermont centric. Now I think it's sort of expanded beyond the borders on many episodes, or at least its applicability expands beyond the borders. What was the thought process back in 2013 of what you wanted to create?
Well, there was a really distinctive absence of thought process, which is, there was very little thought process, which was really helpful. I love, it's so interesting that it's good for me to hear you say that, or it's interesting to hear that your perspective is that it has become less Vermont centric somehow. That's interesting because I have no gauge on that at all. I think that the impulse was to make stuff, and the impulse was to have a kind of more intimate exchange with people than I was hearing on the radio. So I think in 2013 it was still pretty early days for podcasting. So it's funny, I don't even remember. I don't think I even had any. I wasn't even listening to podcasts. I think the only podcasts I was listening to at the time when I started a podcast were Slate podcasts, which, the Culture Gabfest and the Slate Political Gabfest. I was listening to those pretty religiously, but I didn't have. I guess my idea was just to make both long form interviews and documentaries that were more visceral. Or where the inquiry was somehow more visceral. That's what interested me, and I was sort of hoping it might interest somebody else. And I think that's however it's changed, has been very organic and invisible to me. My goals have not become any more specific, really, though I am aware that I am maybe more aware right now of the question of, is this of interest to a national audience, or will this only be of interest to a Vermont audience? That's only a question I've been asking myself quite recently. And I try to kind of set that aside and say, I just can't. I'm hoping that if it's of interest to me, it will be of interest to people who are not like me, but who like what I like.
I think in my own personal opinion that what makes it expand beyond the borders is a lot of the tone or the subject matter or the context that you're placing these stories. These people may have an address in Vermont, or these people may have worked within the state, but the topic matter that you tend to go after or ask people about or look deeper into tends to be much more universal. And I think that's what allows it to expand beyond its borders. Whether that was intentional or not, I think that is what's happening, in my opinion.
Well, I'm so glad. I'm glad. No, I think about somebody like Fred Webster, which is a show I did recently, and this is a guy who lives up in the Northeast Kingdom in Vermont, which is kind of far-flung northeast corner of the state where I live, and he's 94, and he's a super, super old-time Vermont guy. and I wondered, I totally fell in love with this guy. I mean, I spent 2 days with him in his, he lives in the house that he was born in, and he is a really interesting man. And I just fell into the deep end of him over the course of 2 days. And so only later wondered, oh my God, I mean, it's so regional. Is this a very, and then I thought, well, screw it. I don't care. But in the end, when I think it's not about, I mean, I look at that. It's not about being old, and it's not about Vermont. It's about, there are some very universal, questions, or he talks about the things that interest me, I guess, which are work and love and fear of death and these things. So yes, I hope this is true.
Yeah, I would agree, and that was another excellent episode. He was almost a master storyteller in my mind, and maybe artificially, I think almost all people in that age group have just wonderful stories to tell because they're so full of experience and observation and wisdom that any story they tell tends to be wildly engaging. And I think in that type of interview and conversation and episode that we're referring to, and along with so many others that you've done, Erica, the concept is that I think the listener's like, I know somebody like that. Right? Whether it be a grandparent or a friend's grandparent or whatever the case, I know somebody like that, and there's this relatability because of that, and I think that's what's crossing the border, so to speak.
Right, and at the same time, I think about that if something is kind of deep regional, that's a beautiful thing. That's a really good thing. I am very much. I am interested in this place, in where I live. I hate it here, and I love it here. And I mean, I really hate it here, and I really love it here. So that is part of the motor, or I guess, my motivation for making this is that, I mean, this is where I am. I spend, it's a long winter here, and I am interested in how people survive here and what makes this place. But on some level, if you are, if you're interested on some really blood level in where you live, that does translate to other. I mean, people understand that. If you live in Topeka, you still get that. So it translates maybe in that way too.
Right. Tell me about the name for the show, Erica. Rumble Strip.
I did not come up with that name. My friend Stacy came up with that name. I'm really glad she did, but I'm terrible at naming things. I love that name, but I mean, Rumble Strip Vermont. I don't know. She came up with a name. It's a good name.
Do you infer any meaning behind it?
Yeah. I mean, it asks you to slow down. That's as much meaning as I've, when it's also sort of a road reference, and roads are really important here too. So, that's about all I got on that one. But that's, the only thing about that name is, it's hard for people to know whether it's Rumble Strip or Rumble Strip Vermont. So a little confusing in that way. But
one might say from a branding perspective, it opens the door to Rumble Strip, Massachusetts, Rumble Strip, Virginia, Rumble Strip, Kansas.
I think Rumble Strip was taken. I think that was the decider on that one.
Gotcha. Well, it's interesting because, maybe I'm overly deep thinking it, but before our conversation, I was thinking about that name, and I wondered if there was any deeper story, because there is a directional component to it, as you mentioned, or slow down, but the direction concept, almost like conversations and topics about sort of the road you're supposed to travel, meaning that if you veer off the road, there's this thing to bring you back type thing. And I don't know.
That's a beautiful thought. I'm going to steal that.
I could be thinking too deeply about it, but I was curious.
I needed a deep thought. Clearly, I needed a deeper thought.
It's certainly a unique name, and it stands out. And because of that, I almost thought, I wonder if there was a deeper meaning behind it. But feel free, please, steal, borrow, all of those things. You mentioned some of the more regional stories, and of course, those have existed as well. I'm curious, in the listener reception angle of things, have you heard from Vermonters? And if so, what do they think of it?
Yeah, I've heard from, it's interesting. I've heard from Vermonters, and I think that the Vermonters have not until quite recently, maybe this is true everywhere, are not podcast savvy people by and large. It's not a very, I mean, I think a lot of people until Serial, a lot of people thought they had to kind of stare at their computer during the show. So I wrote wrote a tome on the subscribe page about you don't have to do that. But Vermont, it has caught. It seems to be entering the slipstream here a lot lately, which is great. But there's also seems to be a very vocal or a really responsive audience outside of Vermont. But perhaps more outside of Vermont because maybe people outside of Vermont are a little bit more podcast savvy so far. So yeah, I mean, I think, there's the guy, the hairdresser up in St. Johnsbury, which is the gentleman who was a Vietnam combat vet. There were all kinds of responses to that show, which were really interesting because these were people who knew him, who got their hair cut there and never knew about his story. So that was really, really satisfying because, yeah, I guess hopefully for obvious reasons, it was pretty great that people who've known this guy for decades had just never heard his story.
It almost becomes a form of almost community service if you're, shedding light on, a tale like his.
Well, maybe, but my interests are so much more. I try to be very selfish about it. It's really the whole venture is selfish in the sense that I do it because I'm pretty sure that whoever I'm talking with knows something that I want to know because they know something about how to live that I probably need to know. So it's a pretty selfish venture. And so hopefully, if somebody else is served by that, great.
Speaking of learning from folks, it was it's actually the most recent episode, I believe, as we sit here and record right now. And that was your interview with Mark Johnson. And I was it was a great episode and a great conversation, obviously, with a great conversationalist. Mr. Johnson was a local radio host, a 2-hour daily show right there in Vermont for 25 years, if memory serves. So obviously he was very adept at being recorded and talking, and it definitely came through on the episode. But my question for you about this, and I was curious your take, was interviewing someone who you yourself had mentioned that you'd spent many years yourself listening to. What was that like? Did it sort of feel odd or weird? Or, as you mentioned, did you pick up something from him as well in this process?
I was terrible in that interview. So that's my first answer is I think that I hadn't anticipated that that it was sort of felt like looking in a mirror or something. I mean, just because I was aware of, and maybe it was just self-consciousness that, I was aware that he could be assessing me as an interviewer. So that just shut me down completely. Thankfully, I edit a lot. But no, it was wonderful. It was really, it was really fun to hear his stories. I mean, he's a very different kind of interviewer from me, and he, interviewed live and God damn, the guy produced a 2-hour show every day for 5 days a week for 25 years, and he had no producer. Right. So, how do you do that? So that's why I wanted to interview him. So I thought, how do you do that? So that was really interesting. And just to hear him tell stories about how people get nervous, how does one conduct oneself in a live interview 2 hours a day? And he also has, interesting stories about the nature of politics in this state, because he did a lot of interviews with public figures here. It was fun. It was really fun. It was really fun to hear him also, to hear a kind of different register in his voice, because it's a very familiar voice. But when he's, when you're talking about yourself, and you're talking more you're reflecting on yourself, it's a different pace. And I really liked the pace of how he he kind of rolled things out. Plus, it was really fun to interview somebody who actually, who knew how to talk into him.
Right. Right. I can imagine some of the folks that you've spoken to, non-air personalities, may not be as accustomed to the conversation that you're hoping to get from them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But that's also those, people who have never had that's usually the best kind of interview, I think, that's always the most unpredictable and the most interesting interview of people who've never been interviewed before.
Certainly likely to capture an authenticity, without doubt, that you may not receive from, polished speakers.
Yeah.
What is your production process like, Erica? Do you, when you've selected a topic, or how do you go about even finding subjects or interviewees? How do you go about assembling an episode?
Well, I would love to ask you the same question. I wonder this every day. I don't know how I find topics or people, and so far they just have. And there are days when I think, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do now. But usually that only, a couple hours passes and then something happens. I think that they're either people who I know are interesting or know are, who know something I want to know, or it's a topic that's been, or it's a kind of inquiry that's chewing on me for one reason or another. So, in March, at the end of an absolutely brutal, horrifying winter, I was sitting drinking by the wood stove with my friend Peter, and, I was like, we should do we just sort of simultaneously realized that we neither of us is further than about 7 feet from our stove for so long here that you literally are sort of orbiting this object in your house. And so I thought, and so the next day I went out and did a bunch of interviews about wood stoves, because everybody has this weird relationship to this object for so long here. So that was, so sometimes it's just, or I was thinking a lot about age and aging, and thought I really want to interview a bunch of women about aging at different stages. Or again, it's a topic I'm interested in, or it's just that I've always, this is a very small state. So it's, somebody will say, you should freaking interview my cousin Billy. Like, sweet, so there's that way too. Yeah.
Well, it seems to generally work out for you in terms of coming up with what is always a very intriguing listen. I mentioned to you prior to hitting the record button that this is one of my quick listens. I always put it up to the top of the up next list, because I've always been intrigued by some of these conversations, as you mentioned, with those individuals who often aren't always used to having a microphone in front of them, and that is oftentimes super interesting. One of the topic matters you've revisited.
Man, I would love, that is such a, but I am mystified by this question of, I listen to some podcasts and I wonder, I'm always wondering, how did, where did that come from, and how did they find that person?
Right.
And I have this reverse, or what is the word? I think about people who live in LA or live in New York, and I'm like, of course they're surrounded. They're just, the numbers of stories are limitless. But that's true here, because I think you could live in, there are unlimited stories where I live. So that I don't question, but also, I don't know how people find stories, and I'd be really interested to know that, where they come from, or even just, practically, how does one research? How are people doing that? So,
what's interesting is one of my recent episodes, Rob McGinley Myers from Anxious Machine, in talking to him, we sort of bannered around the same topic. And one of the things that he had mentioned to me, he has featured several family members in his episodes, and some of those conversations have been some of the most powerful stories I've heard. He's had some family members go through some extreme experiences, let's say. And I made the statement to him in my conversation was, you never know where the story is going to come from, or everybody has a story. Mm-hmm. And if you I feel that if you start from that concept, that, as you mentioned, there's an unlimited number of stories. And the question is just almost being that filter or applying that creative stroke to bring that story to a level of entertainment or appreciation from a listener that makes it resonate. And I think that's something that you've done wildly successfully. So has Rob. So many other wonderful hosts and producers that I've talked to. And I think, that's something that I can't do. It's something I've never done. I talk to people about what they've accomplished as opposed to really accomplishing anything on my own. But
how is that any different from what we're doing right now?
Well, because I think I have a default story, right? My default story is the intrigue and entertainment and interest that listenership has, either I have personally found or listenership in general has found in someone else's creative endeavor. So before I even hit record with someone, the story is already told, in a sense that somebody has already accomplished something and I want them to talk about it, right? It's clear and it's obvious, so to speak. People look at my episode titles and they say, ooh, I want to know more about this show or this host or whatever the case may be. When you're talking with some of the individuals that we've been discussing, the gentleman in the northeast corner of the state or the vet, who's doing the hair cutting now, that story may not be prevalent to anyone who's, initially meeting them, but you pull that out and assemble. And that's, I think, the talent.
Well, generally, I think good conversation is sort of just good conversation. We can agree to disagree at this point.
Well, the disagreement lies, I think, in the fact that I have much, much more respect for what you do than what anyone should have for what I do. So,
I'm loving the show. So,
well, I greatly appreciate it. I was segueing into one topic that you've revisited on a number of occasions, and I was hoping that maybe you could talk a little bit more about the sort of shows that are framed around legal issues or police blotters and those type of things. Those are always interesting in terms of what's been going on around you and what these issues are. You've done sort of short episodes, you've done longer episodes. I know with the multiple criminal defense attorneys a little while ago. This is obviously, you mentioned that you were a private investigator. So is that sort of has created the bedrock for a lot of those episode types?
Yeah. No, I think, yes, those were, I made a story before this podcast, or, a bunch of years ago, about being a private investigator. And that was when I met Larry Massett and Larry Massett and Hearing Voices, NPR's Hearing Voices. And that was important to me. And, so that, yes, that was, and that's also, as a private investigator, I worked for all of those defense attorneys who are in that show. So I'm inherently interested in those areas in this state. And I knew that those defense attorneys had more stories than I could ever record. And they do. And they're just also natural born storytellers. They're paid to be storytellers. That's what they do. So I wanted to make I don't know. I didn't have any idea what I was going to do with that tape. So I went in. I don't think I can ever start a story if I think too much about it, because I would just be too I wouldn't start because I wouldn't, I'd lose my nerve. And particularly with those guys, they're super edgy people. So I just wandered into a bunch of interviews and came out with a lot of tape. And it's a really long show, but I just love it anyway. And yeah, so that they are amazing people and great storytellers, and I learned so much that I did not know about what about their operating systems, kind of why they do what they do. I really did not. I mean, I've worked for them for years, but I didn't really understand why defense attorneys do what they do until I did that show. And what I love is that they're kind of hateable and lovable at the same time. So yes, that was. And then I recently interviewed a woman I worked for and somebody who I've known for a billion years. Susan Randall is a private investigator here in Vermont, one of the best. And so I think I will be going back. I think I'm going to do a series of interviews with her, or, I'll go back and visit her every now and then, because she's an incredible storyteller also. And just really, she has just an amazing brain. She's really fun. She's fun to listen to. She has amazing riffs and a lot of really interesting stuff to say. So I think I will be visiting Susan again. And then, and she's a PI and has just a lot to say about the population of people that we work with here as private investigators who are not in evidence in any media. I mean, you see them on page 4 of the paper, and you hear about them. They never speak for themselves here, and that's also something that I would like to work on. So that was there's another interview in there with a guy I did who was on I think he was off parole. He was out, but he was kind of just trying to kickstart his life. And so that's another line of I want to be doing more interviews like that too. I feel like there is a population of people here in Vermont who are in and out of jail, in and out on the wrong side of DCF, the Department of Children and Families, and they're invisible, and yet they're our neighbors. We are them, they are us, and we don't hear from them. So, and there's a lot of information, not only in what is said, but the tone of voice and the atmosphere and the house and the grandmother and all that is. What am I trying to say? I guess I'm trying to say I am right now thinking a lot about doing interviews with people who are not much in evidence on the news, but are everywhere in evidence in the news. I see a problem there. Okay. And then the police blotter is, that's just fun. I mean, there are some hilarious things that go on here that get reported to the police. I mean, last month, somebody called in, said, it was reported to the police that a woman called to say that her takeout was not heated to her liking. Wow. You cannot beat that. So I started reading them. I think I did the first one, and then I asked Scott Carrier to do the next one, and he just has the perfect voice to this blotter. So
absolutely.
Right.
I tell you, I'm compelled to ask, Erica, with your interest, your background, and we've already mentioned Serial, and I'm sure you're familiar with Criminal and maybe familiar with Sword and Scale, another show I've featured. There is a thirst for sort of the true crime podcast. Have you ever considered an actual, PI stories, true PI stories or something to that effect as its own standalone show?
I don't think I'd be very good at that.
Really?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think, there are a couple really, doozies in this that are really beautiful stories. It's a whole different, how to make stories where it's this happened and that happened and this happened and find out next week. And I love those stories, but I just don't feel like it's in my DNA, though I'd try it, but it's not second nature to me. Right. For some reason. It's just not it's not what occurs to me naturally. If I were working with a team of people, actually, if I were working with anybody, I would think differently about stories. We had recently here, and again, it comes, you said something earlier about social service or doing something that is of service to others. And I really resist thinking about how anything I do would be of service to anybody else, just because I don't like shows like that. I don't like shows that are trying to help me in some way. And so that said, recently we had a very awful thing happen here in Barrie, which is a town near where I live. There was a really terrible shooting, or there were actually 4 shootings in essentially one day. And it was a woman who shot 3 members of her own family, and then she drove to town and she shot a woman who was a DCF caseworker who had recently been involved in the case that had ended with her, this woman's 9-year-old daughter being taken away and put into foster care. And this rocked our state. It was a horrifying. And, in this state, there isn't anything that happens where you don't know somebody, or you aren't a friend of somebody. So it was horrifying. And the news response to this event was fine, but it was also really predictably about policy. It was about, oh my God, these DCF workers, they work so hard. They're overworked. They're heroes and they're overworked. That's kind of the line. And I don't think that Vermont is unique in this. I think that, crime is often the result of, at least here, multi-generational poverty and drug abuse, right? There's a lot of, and put bluntly, like there's a huge problem with addiction and there are huge problems with poverty. And so I think that what was striking and difficult for me, or what was horrible, is just not ever feeling any closer to any of the people directly involved in this world by the end of the news cycle, and now it's been a month or so since this happened, and I still don't feel any closer to understanding the awful complexity of the problems. And so, so I'm talking a lot. So so we had just talked about my not wanting to make something to be of service to people. But the one thing that I do think is I want to start making some shows that get where people can get an intimate, sort of an inside picture of the worlds of the people actually working on the ground in these ways. So no, I don't think when I talk about kind of following the arc of a crime, I think I'm at least right now, more interested in finding out why do these things happen? And if you do a good interview with somebody where you track back far enough that there isn't anything anybody's done that you can't understand, if you walk with them, that this happened, then that happened, then this happened, then that happened. And of course, then this happens. And that's what I want to try to do with a series of interviews with all the cast of characters, with DCF workers, with cops, with investigators, with lawyers, and with people who find themselves on the wrong side of DCF, or people in the revolving door of the criminal justice system. So, yeah.
The particular event that you highlighted just now, does that story sort of compel you to sort of turn that into an episode / investigation / shining the light on the corners of the story that to give people the understanding that you described missing? Is that something that drives you?
Yes, and that's right. So that's what, and I, maybe it's I don't know, maybe it's foolish of me to imagine that it would be useful. The reality is, I think that I think they'd be interesting interviews, but I also think that it's part of what's missing in these crime stories all over the place. Is we talk about the crime, but we're not talking about the criminal's grandmother and what. These are sailing into parts of the story, and these parts of the story are not explored. And that's what hopefully can be explored in interviews that are deeper hang, and not so much about the exciting trajectory, but about what the hell is going on? How does this happen? What do you dream about if you're a DCF caseworker? How do you raise 3 kids and have, 70 cases that you're working on at the same time, where you're making impossible decisions all day long that no one can make? It's just, these are really difficult problems that people are experiencing. I mean, that people are experiencing everywhere, but they're invisible,
And I would argue that niche, that description of that niche is where
it's so pompous right now.
No. I think that's where podcasting can live and does live in the genres of documentary or storytelling podcasts. When you look at what This American Life does, or Invisibilia, or Snap Judgment, all these great shows. I don't know how many episodes I've listened to, so many different shows covering a topic I've heard about, but they give you information and angles to the story that you were never aware of, and you come away with an understanding of the topic matter that you would not have achieved through mainstream media or any other outlet without those storytellers and those producers and those interviewers bringing that news to light. Even something as simple and basic as stuff you should know. Those type of stories, it lives beneath the surface of mainstream, and that, at least for me as an avid listener, where you do get that value. And maybe community service wasn't the right words earlier, Erica, but maybe a societal service, that you're fulfilling something that is usually not exposed to folks.
Yeah, no, I mean, amen. I guess I could say that first. I totally agree that podcasts are offer something that, yes, they are changing. They are changing the way that we. What am I trying to say? Yes, I agree with everything that you said. I am so grateful to be alive now while this is happening, and I am just I love them, and they're personal. They're deep. They're all friends of mine. I've never met any of these people, and I just am so grateful to them. And the thing about, yes, I think that they do provide a service, but there's such pleasure and in the making of them, and that's what seems to come first, and that's why they are good. And so the service comes second. It comes along with that. It comes along with the joy of them. But yes, I agree. I mean, I think about Scott Carrier's shows, and I think he's just one example of, there's a kind of deep hang that happens in his shows that you cannot find anywhere in any other media now, where you can take the time to, I think I've mentioned this so many times before, but I'll just say it again, because I guess it was the time when I was really struck by this, which was that Alex Chadwick interview he did. And there was something about the pacing. I can't even articulate what it was what was said in the program that moved me so much, but it was the pacing of the program that moved me, that it was slow in a way that I haven't heard anything. Slow, not boring. Slow as in taking time in a way that I haven't heard in so long. And I was so moved by that. I think I listen to public radio now, and it's so quick. That's probably something I don't want to go down. I am thrilled with the podcast that I'm hearing. I feel like I am kept company, and all through the winter I am kept company by these people who I've never met. My personal favorite right now, or the one that I've been listening to a lot lately, is Here Be Monsters, which I just think is unbelievably good.
There's so many great shows out there, and as you mentioned, it's still, in so many ways, even though it's been around for 10 years technically, it just seems like within the last year or two that so many more people are coming to the medium. And it's still in that, I still feel like we're all early adopters. We're all still the cool kids because we found out about this first. It's sort of like trading bubblegum cards when we were kids, where it's like, hey, have you heard about this one? Did you see this one yet? And there's still this word of mouth conversation going on about those hidden gems. And I mean, that whole idea was the idea behind this show. And, it's still that excitement where you find something and you could tell from where it sits on a chart or how many Twitter followers it has that it's still kind of just new and it's this unknown idea. And it's like, oh, I want to tell everybody about this. And that enthusiasm still exists.
Yeah, no, for sure. Though are you beginning to feel podcast anxiety? I'm feeling like I look at my, freaking iTunes thing and there are like 30,000 shows I haven't heard, and I begin to get like cleavage sweat. I'm a little bit like anxious about it now. Like there's almost like I can't keep up.
Oh, I've been there.
You live there.
Yes, I famously have on average 100 shows in my podcast subscription, and I used to think that was a huge number. The reality is I know several others who exceed that. What's worse is now that this is episode 58, I'm now at a point, and this may be the first time on the show I've admitted it, I'm now at the point of unsubscribing to shows I've actually previously recommended, which felt horrible. I felt like I was somehow offending previous, people and listeners, and but sort of the show goes on, at least in the service of my audience. I want to keep bringing out the best stuff. So I forcibly have to unsubscribe from some things because there is so many new and great things continually coming out.
I know, but that fills me with, I don't know, like this kind of dread. It's funny too. You kind of notice, I mean, you have to constantly be listening to a million different things at the same time. I have a hard, just like listening to music, I have a hard time, listening to one band and then switching to another. There's a, you have your, it's mood dependent, right? So I find that I kind of take a deep dive in one show at a time, and it's kind of what I want to listen to. And then I move on. But then I feel, and then months pass and I think, oh my God, I haven't been back to that one in a long time. And I guess the winter is when I catch up. The winter, when it gets dark here at like 2.
Yeah, winters in Vermont allow for lots of podcast listening.
Right.
Podcasting should be huge in all of Northeast, considering how much darkness and snow there is.
I know. I've stood on Main Street beating my breast, but it seems to be working a little bit, but it is taking its time.
Well, I think in November you should have Vermont Rumble Strip little business cards with the iTunes link in the website, and you should go to every Starbucks and set them everywhere.
We don't have any Starbucks around.
Local coffee shops, anything.
Right. Yeah.
Go to the hardware store. Leave them everywhere. A couple things, more things I wanted to run by you here real quick, Erica, and get your perspective of. One more question on the production process. We both mutually know and I'm sure love the team, the twosome over at thetamber.com, and I reviewed your interview with Eric, I believe, Eric and Devin at the Timbre. And in that interview, you talked a lot about the editing process and how much you are really unaware of kind of how this all comes together. That was a few months back. I'm curious, sort of, what is this editing process like for you? Is this still sort of a drudge, or have you become sort of more adept, and is it just a necessary evil, or what are your thoughts?
I have not figured anything out since my interview with Eric. Every single show still is. I mean, I think I'm more comfortable. I think, what I'm more comfortable with now? I'm more comfortable knowing that it's going to suck for a really long time. And it's going to be like 80% mystery tour and then 20% kind of, that feeling, but 80% of it is just going to suck. And you're going to feel like you don't know. I mean, you're going to feel like it sucks and you suck and you don't know what you're doing, but I am now at least confident that if I stay there long enough, I will figure it out.
You've learned to mitigate the suckiness.
My own liking, and and it's like being born again every single time. It's great, when you finish. But so no, I'm not. I'm not systematic about the way. Yes, I am somewhat systematic about. It kind of follows the same series of events. I do interviews, I log tape, I walk around, and I drink a lot of coffee, and I listen and I listen and I listen, and I try to figure out what tape I love and what pauses I love and what was strange left turns in the conversation I love, and then figure out how they work together. And God damn it, I love listening to people talk about editing. I've said this before that I really wish that they had an AA for editing, that it would be so great to go to some anonymous virtual room and cry with other people or editing shows. But I think it's a kind of mysterious process, but I think it kind of has to be. And it's, I guess it's like making anything. You have to figure it out, and it's, you have some methods, but then you have to hope that if you knock at it long enough, it will meet you somewhere in that dark place, and you'll figure it out. And I say that. Yes. So that isn't very specific. Is there anything more specific that I can?
No, I was just curious from reading that interview if how your thoughts had evolved over time.
Yeah, I don't. I do sometimes worry that as most podcasters do, I think, work alone in my closet. So if there's one concern I have, it's that I'll kind of hit a glass, or I'll hit a ceiling where I won't be coming up with new ideas or new approaches to tape. That I imagine that for those people who are working in teams, they have, well, why don't you try that? Or what about this? I do work with Larry Massett when I'm lucky. When I have tape that I know he's going to love, sometimes he edits. And often I can bounce things off him or off Scott Carrier too, has also been really nice about that. And they'll have ideas, and that's just great for people who, people who are honest, who are brutally honest, who can say, I am super bored, or I really like that part. This part needs to come first. That's helpful. So people who are in those wonderful positions of working in teams, I imagine that would be really interesting. So, and I hope what I love also about being, the other thing, what I love about being alone is that I can do whatever the hell I want. I can do whatever I want. So I like to play with different formats. I like, having an idea and then executing and saying, I don't know how it's going to work out. So, but, generally speaking, I do, long form interviews and then documentaries with a number of different voices. But I'm always hoping to try something new.
Well, I'm here to tell you that the finished product, and I'm assuming the finished product is not what you're referring to when you talk about 80% of it might suck, because as far as I'm concerned, I think the finished product comes out great. In fact, here's what I want to do. I want to put a little challenge out there to anyone listening to this. If you have heard Vermont Rumble Strip, or you are just now hearing about it, subscribe to it. Take a listen to several episodes, and then what I want you to do is to email or tweet to both Erica and I, all the links will be in the show notes, folk, and see if you agree with me that I think the editing is great. I don't see any problems. I've never listened to an episode of Vermont Rumble Strip and thought, oh, this editing is terrible. I think it's great. I think it's top-notch, and I think you are just overly practicing in self-deprecation, Erica.
Oh, well, I think yeah, maybe, but I think I'm talking about that it's the road from a big glop of tape to to, I mean, the last 20% is when you're skating, when you feel like you think, oh yes, I kind of see how this operates or how this works. And then you get to polish, or you get to, listen to breaths and
Right.
little micro things. But it's the 80%, it's the vast majority of time is spent in a state of intense, a difficulty and self-doubt.
So is it, would you say it's the editorial decisions? You've got 6 hours of audio that you want to put out a 30-minute episode, and getting to that, finding the storyline through all this audio, that's the real difficult part.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I also think that there's the existential problem of, why. So there's the problem of what is it and what shape should it be? But then there's also the voice in your head that's saying, or that's saying, why are you doing this? And who cares? And why would anyone want to listen to this? And who are you to be doing it anyway? I mean, all of that stuff, which is, I don't know. Maybe that's not true for everybody. Am I alone?
No, I don't think you're alone at all. But I will answer some of those questions. You're doing it for me. All right. Next time it happens, you say, Dan at the Podcast Digest is going to want to hear this. So I'm going to finish this drudgery so that he can listen.
Right.
See, selfish. I'm taking a page out of your book.
Yeah.
Well, Erica, I really appreciate your time this evening. And before we go, I want you to take as much time as you like and tell the folks where they can find Vermont Rumble Strip or your work or anything else you would like to tell people about.
Oh, the place where you can see, it's rumblestripvermont.com, which is, Vermont is spelled out. So rumblestripvermont.com, it's where it is. And, subscribe. That would be great if you wanted to subscribe. And I also would love, I love to hear people's comments and also suggestions. What do you want to hear about? I'd love to hear that. Who you want to hear from? What do you want to hear about? And I don't think there's anything else that I would tell them.
And you're on Twitter, Rumble Strip VT.
Yes, Rumble Strip VT. I'm not a great Twitterer, but I'm getting there. I'm learning. And I don't know, Facebook.
There you go.
Got that. And I'm so grateful that you've listened this far out there, listeners. That's great. And I'm really glad, Dan, that you called. I really appreciate this.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on and to learn more about you and just for myself, selfishly, maintain the theme. I always feel completely more engaged after talking with the great hosts and producers. I've had the opportunity to do so, and I hope folks listening that you feel the same way, that after hearing these conversations with Erica in this episode and any other previous episode, that when you do hit subscribe, that you do feel more compelled to leave an iTunes review or to provide these hosts feedback on Twitter or via email or on their websites. I know, Erica, I was on your website earlier today in preparation for our conversation, and you've got some nice back and forth going in some of the comments on each of the episodes that you released on the website. So folks, you can also jump in the conversation there.
All of those. That's true. You're right. Comments are really, really great. If you imagine people kind of working in their closet, that whatever, of course, I would love to hear what you think about shows. And yes, I am not very good at reminding people that yes, iTunes comments are super helpful because they help new listeners find the show. So that would be wonderful. If you had anything to say, you could say it there too.
And folks, that'll be what I'll leave you with. That'll be my challenge to all of you guys. Before you guys sit down and listen to episode 59, which will be a week from now, whether it would be Erica with Rumble Strip Vermont or any other show that you love, do that service to the hosts and the producers. Leave them a review, send them an email, mention them on Twitter that you enjoyed something. Seriously, speaking for Erica and every other host I've had, it really does mean something when you guys provide that feedback. It certainly does. So Erica, once again, thank you very much for taking the time to join me.
Thanks a lot.
Folks, that'll do it for this week, episode 58 of the Podcast Digest. I hope you enjoyed, and if so, as mentioned, review and feedback would be greatly appreciated. Until next week, folks, as you know, my name's Dan Lizette from the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.